There is a flower that tastes faintly of caramel that comes from a tree needing no irrigation whatsoever, and that will still be producing when your grandchildren are adults. It grows wild across several American states, and most of the people living beside it think it is firewood. And here is the part that ought to stop you. For most of the last century, the United States spent an enormous amount of money, across millions of acres, deliberately trying to destroy it. Not by accident, not through neglect. As policy, with federal and state agencies involved, with equipment built specifically for the job. If you are enjoying videos like this, hit the like button, because these take a great deal of work to put together, and subscribe so you do not miss what is coming next. This is mesquite, and by the end of this, you will know why it feeds people from sand, why an entire industry declared war on it, and the genuinely uncomfortable reason that war was fought because it was not a mistake. And understanding why is the whole point. Let me start with the tree itself, because almost everything about it is the opposite of what a food crop is supposed to be. Mesquite grows across the Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts, through Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Southern California, and down into Mexico. It grows in ground that will not support ordinary agriculture in places that receive a fraction of the rainfall a crop needs in soils that are thin, alkaline, and hostile. And it does that because of what is underneath it. Mesquite sends down a taproot of extraordinary length, not a few feet. The deepest documented plant root ever recorded is generally attributed to a mesquite in the Sonoran Desert, found at a depth that is difficult to picture, reaching down well over 150 feet in search of water. Think about what that means for a farmer. Every crop you have ever planted lives in the top layer of soil and depends entirely on what falls from the sky that season. When the rain fails, the crop fails. Mesquite is not participating in that arrangement. It has gone underneath the weather entirely and found the water table, and it is drinking from a supply that does not care whether it rained this year, which is why, in a drought that killed everything else, mesquite kept producing. And there is a second property that matters just as much, and it is the reason mesquite improves the ground it stands in. Mesquite is a legume. It is in the same family as beans and peas, and like them, it hosts bacteria in its roots that pull nitrogen out of the air and fix it into the soil in a form plants can use. Nitrogen is the single most important nutrient in agriculture, and it is the one we spend enormous energy manufacturing industrially. A mesquite is making it underground for free and leaving it behind. So you have a tree that requires no irrigation, no fertilizer, no replanting, and no cultivation, that fertilizes the soil it grows in, and that produces food for decades. Now, let me tell you about the food, because this is where the title comes from. Mesquite produces long pods, and inside those pods is the part that matters, not the seed, which is hard and difficult. The pod itself, the fibrous pulp around the seeds, is naturally sweet. Dry those pods and grind them, and you get mesquite flour, and it does not taste like flour. It tastes sweet, faintly of caramel and molasses, with a slight nuttiness. People who try it for the first time consistently describe it as tasting like a dessert ingredient rather than a staple. And nutritionally, it is genuinely unusual because the sweetness is not the whole story. Mesquite flour is high in fiber and contains a meaningful amount of protein, which is not what you expect from something sweet. And crucially, its sugars are largely fructose, which the body processes without requiring insulin in the way glucose does, and the fiber slows absorption further. The result is a sweet food with a low glycemic index, which is a rare combination. And it is why mesquite flour turns up in specialist health food shops today at prices that would astonish anybody watching. A tree being bulldozed in Texas. That is the honest version of the phrase in the title. It is not better than honey in every respect, and it is a natural sweetener that behaves very differently in the body from refined sugar or syrup. And it comes off a tree that nobody watered. And there is a genuine honey connection worth mentioning, because it is not a coincidence that the two words end up together. Mesquite flowers heavily in long pale catkins, and it is an excellent nectar source. Mesquite honey is a recognized varietal, prized for being light-colored and mild. And beekeepers in the Southwest deliberately move hives to mesquite stands when it blooms. So the same tree that ranchers were bulldozing was, in the same landscape, supporting commercial honey production. Which means the eradication campaign was not only removing a human food source, it was removing the forage that a beekeeping industry depended on. in a region where flowering plants are not exactly abundant. That is the pattern with mesquite, generally. Almost every part of the tree has value to somebody, and the decision to remove it was made by weighing one-use cattle forage against all of them combined. Now, the history, because this food was not discovered by health shops across the deserts of the southwest and northern Mexico, mesquite was a staple, not a supplement, not a famine food, a staple for thousands of years. Peoples across that region built substantial portions of their diet around it. Pods were harvested when dry, stored, and ground in stone mortars into meal. That meal was eaten as cakes, mixed with water into a drink, fermented, and used as a sweetener for everything else. And the reason is exactly what I described. In a landscape where agriculture is precarious and rainfall is unreliable, mesquite was the food that did not fail. When the corn failed, the mesquite was still there because its water supply was 100 feet down. Every part of the tree had a use. The wood for building and fuel and tools, the bark for fiber and cordage, the sap as a gum, and the pods as food. The pods were the reason people could live where they lived, and the processing was a genuine technology, not simply picking things up. Pods were gathered when dry and stored whole, often in raised granaries built to keep them off the ground and away from moisture and animals. Because a stored food that spoils is worse than no store at all. Kept properly, they last a very long time, which is exactly what you want from a staple. The grinding was done in stone mortar, and in some places those mortars were not portable objects, but holes worn into bedrock outcrops over generations of use. You can still find them sitting in the desert, dozens of round depressions ground into solid rock by people processing pods in the same spot for centuries. That detail tells you more than any description could. Nobody wears a hole in bedrock, preparing an occasional snack. Those sites are the equivalent of a village mill, and their existence is the physical evidence of how central this food was. The meal was then used in several forms, pressed into cakes and dried, which stored well and traveled. Mixed with water into a sweet drink, fermented into a mildly alcoholic beverage in some communities, and used to sweeten everything else that was being eaten. So this was not merely a wild food somebody nibbled. It was a harvested, stored, milled, and processed staple with dedicated infrastructure, and it supported populations in country where nothing else would. Now, what happened, and this is where the story turns, cattle arrived. And here is the first piece of the irony, and it is the one almost nobody says out loud. Cattle love mesquite pods. They are sweet, they are nutritious, and livestock eat them enthusiastically, wherever they find them. But mesquite seeds are hard, and they pass through an animal undigested, so a cow eats pods in one place, walks and deposits the seeds somewhere else in a warm pile of dung, which is close to ideal conditions for germination. The cattle were planting mesquite. Now the second piece, and it is bigger. Before European settlement, that landscape was grassland with scattered mesquite, and two things kept the balance. Grass competed with mesquite seedlings for water, and periodic fires swept through the grass, and those fires killed young mesquite before it could establish. Heavy grazing removed the grass, which removed the competition, and because fire needs continuous grass to carry it, removing the grass also removed the fires, and settlers were actively suppressing fires as well, because fire threatens property and livestock. So the two forces holding mesquite in check were both eliminated by ranching at the same time across the same landscape. The result was mesquite spreading across enormous areas of former grassland, which ranchers experienced as an invasion. And from a rancher's point of view, it genuinely was a disaster. A pasture full of mesquite carries far fewer cattle than a pasture of grass. The trees take water, they take space, the thorns injure animals and people, and they make working stock genuinely difficult. So the industry declared war on it. And I want to be careful here, because this is where a lot of coverage goes wrong. This was not stupidity, and it was not a conspiracy. From inside the logic of a ranch, mesquite was destroying the value of the land, and the response was rational. It was also enormous. Mesquite is legally classified as a noxious weed in Texas and in other states, which restricts planting and movement, and it made eradication an official objective rather than a private preference. State agencies, federal agencies, including the Department of Agriculture and Agricultural Extension Services, all supported control efforts. Programs were funded. Research was conducted specifically into how to kill it more effectively, and the methods were serious. Herbicides applied by aircraft across enormous acreages. Root plowing, which means dragging a blade through the ground at depth to sever the taproot. Chaining, which means dragging an anchor chain between two crawler tractors to tear trees out bodily. And burning. Across the 20th century, this was applied to millions of acres, repeatedly, because mesquite resprouts from the root crown and a single treatment is rarely permanent. That last point is worth staying with, because it is the detail that reveals how the whole campaign actually went. Mesquite does not die when you cut it down. It has a root crown at the base, below or at ground level, containing dormant buds, and it will send up new stems from that crown after almost anything you do to the top of the plant. Cut it, and it comes back multi-stemmed and bushier than before, which is worse for a rancher than what he started with. Burn it, and it comes back from the crown, which is precisely why root plowing exists. The only reliable mechanical kill is to sever the plant below that crown, which means dragging a blade through the ground at depth across an entire pasture, at enormous cost in fuel and equipment, tearing up the soil as you go. And even that is not permanent, because the seed bank is still in the ground and cattle are still walking around distributing more. So ranchers found themselves in a treatment cycle rather than a solution. Clear it, get several years of grass, watch it return, clear it again. Every cycle costing money, every cycle damaging soil. Studies of the economics of mesquite control have repeatedly found that the return on that spending is marginal in many situations, and negative in some, once the recurrence is accounted for. That is the shape of the thing. Not a war that was won, but a war that had to be refought every decade, on land that was being degraded by the fighting. Now hold the two halves of that together. A tree that produces sweet, high-protein flour that needs no irrigation in a region defined by drought, that fixes nitrogen into its own soil, and that fed the people of that landscape for thousands of years, and a national effort, over decades, to remove it from millions of acres, because it was competing with grass for cattle. That is not a lost technology. It is a food source that was actively, deliberately, and expensively destroyed in living memory in the United States because a different use of the land was more profitable. And that difference in value is the whole story. Nobody hid the fact that the pods were edible. The knowledge never went anywhere. It simply stopped mattering to the people making decisions about the land. Now, let me be honest about the other side, because the ranchers were not imagining their problem. Dense mesquite genuinely does reduce forage. The thorns are genuinely vicious. In heavy stands, it genuinely does make land harder to use for grazing. And grazing is how a great many people in that region make a living. And there is a genuine ecological debate about mesquite encroachment that continues today, involving water use, grassland, bird habitat, and the character of an entire ecosystem. This is not a case with an obvious villain. What is worth noticing is not that anyone was evil. It is that a plant can be simultaneously a nuisance to one industry and a food source of real value. And that we spent an extraordinary amount of effort on the first fact while almost entirely ignoring the second. Now, the practical part, because this tree is still there and the pods are still free. If you live in mesquite country, harvest happens in summer, generally somewhere between June and September, depending on where you are and the season. You want pods that are fully dry and have turned tan or straw-colored, not green. The genuine tradition is to pick them from the tree rather than from the ground, because pods lying on the soil pick up moisture and mold. And that is the single most important point in this entire section, so let me give it the space it deserves. Mesquite pods can develop a mold that produces a toxin, and this is not a minor concern. Discard any pod with dark spots, black specks, discoloration, or any musty smell. If a pod is damp, it goes in the bin. If a pod has been on wet ground, it goes in the bin. Pick dry pods from the tree in dry weather, and inspect every one, then dry them further at home until they snap cleanly rather than bending, and store them somewhere genuinely dry. To make flour, the pods are ground whole, and here is where a practical problem arrives. The seeds inside are extremely hard enough to damage an ordinary kitchen grinder, and traditionally they were separated out rather than ground. The usual home approach is to break the dry pods up, grind in batches, and sieve, keeping the fine sweet meal and discarding the hard seed fragments and coarse fiber. Some people use a hammer mill. A robust blender will manage in small batches and will not enjoy it. The flour is not a wheat substitute. It has no gluten, and it will not behave like bread flour. What it is superb at is being blended in at 10 to 30% of a mix, where it adds sweetness, color, and a genuine depth of flavor to pancakes, biscuits, cakes, and bread, and it lets you cut back the sugar. It is also excellent stirred into drinks, which is how it was traditionally used. And in the traditional way of eating, there was no baking involved at all, if you want the simplest possible first attempt. That traditional route is where I would start, because it removes the grinding problem entirely. Take dry, clean pods, break them into pieces, and steep them in hot water the way you would make a tea. Leave it, strain it, and taste it. What you get is a sweet, faintly caramel drink, made from a tree, with no equipment beyond a pan and a sieve. That single experiment tells you whether the flavor is worth pursuing before you commit to grinding anything or damaging a blender. And it is genuinely how a great many people in the region still use them. If you like it, then go and solve the flour problem. If you do not, you have lost an afternoon and learned something about a tree you walk past. 2 more cautions before anybody goes out with a bucket. Identify the tree properly. Mesquite belongs to a group of plants that include species you would not want to confuse it with, so use a regional field guide or ask somebody local before you harvest anything. And think hard about where the tree is standing. Mesquite grows on rangeland, and rangeland is exactly where herbicide has been applied for a century. Do not harvest from land that may have been sprayed, from roadsides, or from anywhere near industrial or agricultural chemical use. This is the same rule that applies to any wild food, and it matters more here than usual, precisely because of the history I just described. Now the other product, and this is the one that survived, mesquite wood. While the tree was being torn out of pasture, somebody worked out that the wood was superb for cooking. Mesquite smoke has a strong, distinctive flavor, and it became a defining element of Texas barbecue and spread across American cooking. So there is a real irony sitting in the middle of this. The same tree was being bulldozed off rangeland at public expense and sold as premium smoking wood at the same time. And for a great many people, the only thing they know about mesquite is that it is what you put in a smoker. The wood is also genuinely beautiful. It is hard, dense, extremely stable, and it takes a superb finish, and mesquite furniture and flooring command high prices. So the tree that was declared a weed produces a premium sweetener, a premium smoking fuel, and a premium hardwood, and puts nitrogen in the ground while it does it. Now the honest limits, because I promised them, the first is the thorns, and they are not a footnote. Mesquite thorns are long, sharp, and they will go through a boot sole. Harvesting means gloves, decent footwear, and paying attention. The second is the labor. Harvesting and processing pods is real work, and it is why mesquite flour costs what it does in a shop. This was a food produced by communities with stone, mortar, and time, and there is no version of it that is quick. The third is the seeds and the equipment problem I gave you, which is the reason most people who try this once do not do it twice. The fourth is that the ecological question is genuinely unsettled. Mesquite encroachment into grassland is a real change to an ecosystem. And the fact that the pods are edible does not settle the argument about whether millions of acres of grassland should become woodland. And the fifth is legal. In states where it is listed as a noxious weed, planting or transporting it may be restricted, and if you are thinking of putting one in your garden, check your local rules first. That is the literal answer to the word banned in the title. And it is worth taking seriously rather than treating as a joke. Now, sit with the shape of this for a moment, because I think it is the most interesting thing in the whole story. We are used to a particular kind of narrative about lost knowledge. Something valuable is forgotten or suppressed, or the last person who knew it dies, and it slips out of the world quietly. This is not that. Nobody forgot mesquite. The pods have been edible the entire time. Indigenous communities in the region never stopped knowing it, and books were written about it. And agricultural researchers studying how to kill the tree were perfectly aware that its pods were a traditional food. The knowledge was never lost. It was simply outloaded. Land in that region was worth more with cattle on it than with mesquite on it, by the measure being used, and so the tree became a weed. Not because anything about the tree changed, but because the purpose of the land did, and that is a far more uncomfortable idea than suppression, because it means a genuinely valuable thing can sit in plain sight, fully documented entirely understood and still be destroyed at scale, simply because the people making the decision were measuring something else. There are 10 million acres out there where that decision was made, and the trees are still coming back, because a plant with a root 150 feet deep is very difficult to argue with. And that stubbornness is now being reconsidered, quietly, by people who are not sentimental about it at all. The reconsideration is coming from drought. Water in the Southwest is the defining constraint of the entire region, and it is tightening. Aquifers are declining, allocations are being argued over in courts, and irrigated agriculture in some areas is facing genuinely hard limits. In that context, a food crop that requires no irrigation stops being a curiosity and starts being a serious proposition. Researchers and growers in the United States, Mexico, and in dryland regions elsewhere have looked seriously at Prosopis species as a crop for exactly that reason. Related species have been planted deliberately in arid regions on several continents as a source of food, fodder, fuel, and shade, and in some of those places it has been a genuine success. It has also, in some places, become a serious invasive problem, which is worth saying plainly because this plant is capable of both, and introducing it somewhere new has gone badly often enough that it is a genuine cautionary tale in itself. So the honest position is not that mesquite was misunderstood and should be planted everywhere. It is that a plant which produces food without irrigation, in a region running out of water, deserves a more careful accounting than the one it received in the 20th century. That accounting is finally happening, and it is being driven by the water table rather than by nostalgia. So the question worth arguing about in the comments is this one. If you live in mesquite country, have you ever eaten the pods? Or did you grow up thinking of that tree purely as firewood and a nuisance? And if you have made the flower, tell me how you dealt with the seeds. Because that is where everybody's first attempt falls apart, and almost nobody explains what actually worked. Tell me in the comments.